There are people who have always perceived too much, not out of vanity or some special gift, but because they were born with a sensitivity that doesn't turn off. They walk into a room and feel what no one has put into words. They hear a sentence and grasp what was left unsaid. Their body registers discomforts that others ignore. They don't need explanations. They need silence, because it's within silence that everything becomes clearer. This awareness doesn't show up all at once. It's continuous, quiet, persistent. From an early age, these people feel the world moving to a rhythm that doesn't match theirs. While everyone else seems comfortable with the flow of life, they live with the sense that something is off. They can't explain what it is. They just feel it. And feeling too much, without the space to process what you're feeling, is a kind of loneliness that can't be seen, but it weighs. Over time, this sharp perception becomes a lens. One that doesn't choose what it sees. It simply reveals. And what it reveals isn't always pretty. Social masks, fake affections, intentions disguised as care. When you see all of this with clarity, you can't play the game anymore. You live in between. You participate, but don't blend in. You speak, but go silent inside. This subtle separation, between being present and not belonging, grows quietly. And it begins to create a rare kind of lucidity, one that doesn't seek to be understood, but can no longer pretend. This is where something begins to move within. Something that isn't new, but is now starting to take shape. A center, a quiet core, a strength that doesn't come from outside and doesn't need approval. It only asks for space, because it's alive. This strength is fragile and resilient at the same time. It doesn't shout, but it persists. It doesn't demand, but it grows. At first, it just feels like discomfort, then disconnection, and finally, a quiet certainty. You're not falling apart. You're being reorganized. Everything collapsing on the outside is what could no longer support what exists inside. The soul, when it finds no reflection, withdraws. But in withdrawal, it doesn't disappear, it prepares. And there is a preparation happening within you now, even if everything seems unclear. A process is underway, even if the world can't see it. A seed has been planted, and it has already begun to move. Living in society requires a specific kind of adaptation. You're expected to be pleasant, productive, light. You're expected to join conversations, to smile easily, to share opinions even when nothing you say feels true. The world moves toward what is simple, fast, predictable. And if you don't follow that rhythm, it's as if you're failing. But some people can't follow that path without paying a heavy price. Those who feel too much must dim their intensity to be accepted. They have to adjust their speech, rehearse their expressions, maintain their posture. They have to stay alert. And this constant effort takes its toll. Spontaneity vanishes, truth shrinks, presence fractures. You keep functioning, but you're no longer whole. Carl Jung called this social mask the persona, something we all learn to wear. It's necessary, without it, there is no coexistence. But when the persona becomes all we show, when what we truly feel has to be hidden so the mask won't slip, an inner abyss opens. You begin to perform. And the more you perform, the further you drift from who you are. Jung and Winnicott spoke of this same process using a different name, the false self, a version of the self shaped to please, to avoid conflict, to secure acceptance. It's the self that learns to survive when the real self is rejected or ignored. And over time, this false self becomes so strong that the true self fades quietly away. You might not notice it right away. Because this adaptation brings rewards. You're praised, included, promoted. But inside you start to lose air. The spaces you occupy don't nourish you. The conversations you maintain don't move you. The bonds you keep don't see you. And even when everything looks right, something inside you starts to slowly fall apart. The soul, when it goes unrecognized, begins to wither, not with fever or visible pain, but with a slow hollowing out. You feel present but not alive, active but absent, as if part of you is always locked away inside, waiting for a moment that never comes to finally show up whole. This kind of exhaustion isn't normal. It doesn't come from doing too much, but from being too far removed from yourself. Every time you silence your discomfort to keep the peace, something inside you is betrayed. And this repetition, over time, turns you into a stranger in your own life. But even in that state, something resists. A part of you is watching everything. A quiet presence that never fully gave in. It's this presence that starts to stir when the world asks too much of you. And it's from that presence that, one day, you might return, not to what others expect, but to what's real. The body stores everything the soul had no place to hold. It holds the interrupted conversations, the swallowed emotions, the muffled fears, the unanswered questions. At first glance, you think it's just tiredness, just stress, just a phase. But the body doesn't lie. It responds every time you stay silent when you should be listening to yourself. Every time you accept what hurts you just to avoid bothering others. Every time you pretend to be fine when everything inside you is falling apart. Carl Jung sensed this long before modern psychology confirmed it. The unconscious manifests in the body when it has no space in the mind. Everything that was repressed, denied, or ignored turns into tension, unexplained pain, interrupted sleep, chronic anxiety. And even if you can't name what's happening, you feel it. Because the body feels first. Psychosomatics calls this somatization, when unexpressed psychic pain finds a way to exist physically. Not because you want it to, but because when the soul is silenced, it looks for alternative exit. And that exit is almost always a plea: look within. Listen. Take care. But in a culture that values performance over integrity, even the body starts to get ignored. You feel exhausted, but drink coffee. You feel tightness in your chest, but keep smiling. Your stomach churns, but you still reply to messages. You learn not just to silence your voice, but to mute the very signals of life coming from within. Over time, you get used to living in a tired body. You normalize the weight on your shoulders, the constant irritation, the fatigue that doesn't go away even with rest. And the worst part is, this seems to be expected, like it's somehow acceptable to live this way, as long as you keep functioning. As long as you keep delivering, replying, performing. But there's a limit. And when that limit is crossed, the soul demands payment. Not with screams, but with subtle collapses. Disconnection becomes visible. Nothing moves you anymore, nothing inspires you, nothing makes sense. Outwardly, you may still be living, but inside, you've already started to die slowly. This is the point where many people fall ill, but it's also where some begin to awaken. Because there's a thin thread that, even in pain, keeps pulling you back. And it's through that thread that your return begins. Not to productivity, not to the old normal, but to a more integrated way of being in the world. The body doesn't want punishment. It wants to be heard. It's not trying to ruin your life. It's trying to warn you. You learn to speak less so you wouldn't be misunderstood. To feel in silence so you wouldn't be called dramatic. To think twice, 3 times, before sharing what's going on inside you, because you've realized not everyone wants to know, and even fewer want to feel it with you. At first, that silence feels like protection. And it is. It shields you from cold reactions, shallow replies, impatient looks. It preserves the most sensitive parts of you. But over time, that same silence becomes heavy. What once was shelter turns into a prison. You keep thinking, feeling, living intensely, but alone, without witnesses, without echo. Communication is more than speaking. It's a form of connection. When you say something real and someone truly listens, a transformation occurs on both sides. Carl Rogers said that being heard with empathy has an almost miraculous effect on the psyche. But when that doesn't happen, when you share how you feel and receive only canned advice, generic phrases, or subtle judgments, something inside you pulls back. And it pulls back so often it begins to disappear. You stop trying. Not because you've lost the ability to speak, but because it no longer feels worth showing yourself to someone who only wants to fit you into a comfortable mold. Depth is intimidating. Sensitivity requires presence. And few people are willing to hold that kind of space. Levinas said the face of the other is what calls us into ethical responsibility. We cannot fully exist without this mutual recognition. When it's missing, the soul weakens. And you feel it in your body, in your emotions, in your energy fading away bit by bit. It's like you're living only halfway, dimming your inner light so no one complains about the brightness. But this kind of silence, painful as it is, also reveals what truly matters. It shows you that not every kind of listening heals you. Not every relationship sustains you. Not every presence calms you. You don't want an audience. You want depth. You want to be read like a rare book, with time, with care, with full attention. While that space doesn't exist outside, you start looking for it inside. And slowly you begin to understand that silence can transform. From a prison, it can become fertile soil. From absence, it can become presence. From emptiness, it can become shelter. And that's where something changes. You no longer give up on being whole. You just stop trying to fit into places that were never made for you. You spent so long trying to hide your intensity that you almost believed it was a flaw. You nearly convinced yourself you were too fragile, too demanding, too difficult. Because at some point, someone told you that feeling this deeply was too much, and you believed them. Or at the very least, you tried to adjust. But sensitivity isn't instability. It's presence. It's a way of being in the world that notices what others ignore, feels what others avoid, and carries an emotional radar that, when well nurtured, can become your greatest source of clarity. Jung knew this. He saw sensitivity not as some fringe trait, but as a gateway to the deepest layers of the unconscious. It's through this openness that symbols emerge, that inner images come to life, that hidden meanings begin to organize themselves. Sensitivity is a form of wisdom, but it's a wisdom that wasn't made for shallow spaces. That's why it pulls back. That's why it feels uncomfortable. Because where there is no silence, it suffocates. Where there is no truth, it shuts down. Where there is no listening, it gets lost. But it doesn't vanish. It transforms into intuition, into hunches, into a constant unease that keeps nudging you, even when you try to dismiss it. Keeps trying to bring you back inside, to the place where your essence still beats. What many call drama is really perception. What they label as too much intensity is often just your attempt to live fully in a world that insists on breaking everything into pieces. And that's why you feel so tired. Not because you're wrong, but because you've been bending too much to fit into places that don't speak your language. The moment you stop fighting your sensitivity and start caring for it, something shifts. You no longer need to constantly defend yourself. You begin making choices based on what nourishes you, not on what others demand. You start protecting yourself without shutting down. Saying no without guilt. Refusing what pulls you away from yourself. Jung used to say that having light isn't enough. You need to know where and how it shines. Your sensitivity is that light. If it isn't welcomed with awareness, it can burn. But when it finds direction, it heals. First you, then everything you touch. There comes a time when the soul can no longer stand the external noise. The agitation becomes exhausting. The pressure to respond to everything wears you out. The effort to be understood becomes unsustainable. And then, almost without realizing it, you begin to return. not to the past, but inward. This return comes with no map, no promises. It doesn't offer formulas or guarantees. It happens quietly. While the world keeps shouting for your attention, you begin to withdraw. Not out of fear, but because something truer is calling. It's in this moment that the center begins to realign. A part of you that's always been there, but never had room, begins to speak. It doesn't speak in words. It speaks in subtle sensations, in a strange peace that arises in the middle of chaos, in a deep sense that, despite everything, something in you remains uncorrupted. When Jung studied the Taoist work The Secret of the Golden Flower, he realized that this ancient process described in the East was more than a spiritual practice. It was symbolic language for what he already saw unfolding in his most sensitive patients. The golden flower was the perfect image for that silent transformation that begins from the psychic center, far from masks, far from expectations, far from the persona. It doesn't bloom in plain sight. It blooms where no one sees, within. In silence, in the dark, at the right time, and the most beautiful part, this blooming doesn't depend on the world. It doesn't need approval, an audience, or recognition. It only needs one thing, for you to stop abandoning yourself. Maybe you haven't named it like that, but you've felt it. Something inside you is being restructured. A new consciousness, steadier, calmer. It's not the absence of pain, it's the presence of meaning. It's as if, even without understanding everything, you're beginning to trust. Not in ready-made answers, but in your own inner movement. When this center begins to bloom, it reorganizes everything. The urgency fades. The rush loses its grip. Comparison stops making sense. And in place of the old struggle for acceptance, a new desire is born, to exist fully, even if no one sees. The return to yourself is not a step back. It's a new beginning, but this time with roots. It's the start of a presence that no longer depends on what others say, because it's finally starting to hold itself up. Not all pain is noise. Some pain moves in silence. It hurts in the body, in the chest, in the racing thoughts. And no matter how much you try to numb, distract, or forget, it comes back. Because it's not here to punish you. It's trying to show you something. The pain that lingers isn't just suffering, it's a language. And like any language, it wants to be heard. There are pains that don't ask for medicine. They ask for listening, for care, for pause. They ask you to stop running from yourself and start translating what you're feeling with honesty. Many people believe that being too sensitive is weakness, that feeling deeply is a flaw to be fixed. But Jung saw the opposite. For him, it's in the internal friction between who we are and who we were forced to appear to be that true transformation is born. Pain is the friction between the soul and the mask. And when that friction becomes unbearable, it doesn't mean you failed. It means something in you refuses to live on autopilot any longer. The soul is asking to be let through. And that's the moment the flower begins to open. Not just any flower, but the one Jung saw symbolized in Taoism, the golden flower, a spiritual center that blooms in silence after a long process of inner return. It is born when everything outside has fallen apart, but something inside still lives. When the persona falls and the self awakens. This flower doesn't need to be visible to be real. It doesn't show up on social media. It doesn't attract applause. But it changes everything in the one who feels it, because it brings no promises. It brings presence, a quiet peace, a knowing that no longer needs explanation, only to be sustained. Everything you've lived through up to now was not in vain. Every disconnection, every moment of loneliness, every emotional confusion, it was all part of this blooming. The flower only appears after the winter. And maybe you're just now coming out of it. You're not broken. You're returning. You're reorganizing your soul after years of reshaping yourself to fit. You're recovering parts of you that got trapped in silence. And you're beginning to feel, for the first time, that there's a place within you where everything makes sense, even if no one else understands. That place is sacred, and it's what will sustain you when everything else fails. So keep going, even if it feels slow, even if no one notices. Keep going, because inside your silence, a flower is opening, and it only needs one thing: that you don't give up on yourself,